How we doing? It's Miss Lally, and today our segment is going to be on the slave trade. So if you could take out your notes, that would be great. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the slave trade in Africa specifically. But the slave trade is something that happens all over the world, even today, that we'll find out. So there's lots more research you could do on this topic, and we're just going to get a little slice. So here we go. Let me get a full screen here. Oops. View screen. Okay. So originally, why were the Portuguese interested in Africa in the 1400s? We know that Europeans really wanted to trade with Asia at this time. In the 1400s is kind of just the beginning of the age of imperialism, and where European nations are beginning to see other parts of the world as beneficial to get raw materials. So raw materials could be like lumber, rubber, natural resources like minerals, silk, whatever. You know, all different places have different raw materials, and the Europeans were looking to make a profit, make their countries more wealthy by really exploiting these nations in other parts of the world. So specifically Portugal, they were looking for a sea route to India around Africa. So they're trying to figure out how we're going to get to India, and they were like, well, let's go around Africa. The reason why, you're like, well, why didn't they just go through the Mediterranean? Well, in the Mediterranean, text message, the Mediterranean was really dominated by Italy, and the Italians had control over it, and they were, and they didn't really like other nations going through. So, in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz finds an all-water route to India from Europe, from Portugal, and so the Portuguese eventually see Africa as a great little stopping point, a little pit stop, and they start to build trading stations on the coasts, and they even start to begin to bring in Christian missionaries to convert people in Africa to Christianity. So this is the beginning of a lot of imperialism. So slavery, how did this happen? Well, you will also know that European rulers begin to, like Spain and Britain, eventually they begin to create colonies in the Americas. And originally they have Native Americans as laborers, but pretty quickly Native Americans die out because of the diseases that are transmitted from Europe to the New World. And so Europeans are like, we know we will get Africans who seem to be better suited to harsh climate and harsh conditions. And how awful is that? Really awful. And so what they do is they start bringing boatloads of people mostly from West Africa over to the New World, and they begin to introduce slavery on a pretty massive scale. And so what was slavery like in Africa? Slavery has existed all over the world since ancient times. It's not a new concept. But in most societies, slaves were treated more like servants, and slavery wasn't necessarily a permanent condition. They were oftentimes eventually would become a part of the community. They could ultimately own property and have lives that are not as something else besides a slave. And also, slavery and before European imperialism is not racial, and that's really the big difference. So when the slavery is introduced on a massive scale, Africans go through the Middle Passage, which is, you probably have heard of, this boat ride from Africa across the Atlantic to the New World. It's really, really dangerous. Many, many people die. You can just imagine people chained to the boat and through a storm, and your skin is ripped, and it's awful, and it's dirty, and you can think of people with no place to go to the bathroom besides just right where they're lying, and it's just really, really miserable, and we have not experienced anything as awful. So this would be an example of what's called forced migration. So migration from one place to another, as we know, is an example of movement, and this would be an example of forced migration. The African people from West Africa did not have a choice. And so racism really begins. We have in the we're not going to go too much into America, but you think about, we have people from Europe who, even though they're from different cultures, are all white skinned. And then people from Africa, even though they're from all different cultures, really have dark skin. And then you go to America, and you have people who are what we would call Native Americans or American Indians, and they have even a different color skin, which is maybe a little bit more in between. And there's this beginning of race. And so even though people who are native to America have all different cultures and all different languages and all different religions, and same with the Europeans and same with the Africans, they begin to see one another as mostly being different based on race. So kind of interesting. Eventually, Great Britain, England, is part of Great Britain. They, in 1807, outlaw the slave trade. And so there's this abolition movement. Abolition is a movement to end slavery. And the effect on the slave trade in the rest of the world is that Britain also convinces some other nations to ban slavery. The United States, as we know, did not quite yet. Did the outlawing of the slave trade mean that slavery ended? No, because think of it, since slaves were considered property, I'm going to use an example. Like if you banned the selling of cigarettes, people would still smoke them. They just wouldn't be sold, right? So, plus, slaves can reproduce, whereas cigarettes cannot, so it's a little bit different. Slavery did not end, because even though they weren't buying and selling new slaves legally, it still did happen illegally. It continued in the U.S. until 1865, technically. Slavery became illegal based on the Civil War amendments in 1865. However, slavery this is maybe a little known fact to you guys, slavery does still exist in our world today, and there are actually more slaves now in the world than there ever were before. So there's approximately 27 million slaves in the world, and this is a really different issue, but a very important issue. There's even slaves in Atlanta. And you might be wondering, what in the world is that about? So if you want some more information, I would encourage you to do some research. And here's one website I found. And I'm pretty passionate about this, so we can talk about this more if you want. It's not for the faint of spirit. So if this is something that it's kind of a more mature topic, so I would just ask you to use caution when looking at websites and talking about it with people, because it requires some maturity that maybe not all of you have. You can judge that for yourself. Okay, so moving on. Why did slavery eventually die out in Africa? You might say maybe there was a movement, this leader, some great reason. They all realized it was awful. Well, no, not exactly. European nations went through what we call industrialization. And that word means going from using human and animal power to using machines. So think of an example in your home. You want clean clothes, you have a washing machine. Well, that's because we went from having humans wash the clothes by hand, takes a long time, to a machine washing the clothes. That's one small example of industrialization. And so pretty much everything you are wearing, everything you can see right now was produced by a machine. Very few things are handmade or made by human power. And so as this happens in Europe and also America to some extent, it happened a little bit later, they really needed materials more than they needed people. So again, it wasn't really this benevolent movement. It was more like a practical thing. But hey, we'll take it, right? Okay, diaspora. I would ask you to repeat that with me. Diaspora. Good. Okay, so give examples of how it survived in the world. So diaspora literally means a scattering of people. Okay, so then we're talking specifically about the African diaspora. When the slave trade happened, Africans, people of African descent, were scattered all over the world. So actually Brazil had more slaves than any other place. So that's kind of interesting. You think about North America having most slaves. Well, Brazil had a fifth of all the slaves. Pretty significant amount. So, we have African culture that's scattered all over the world. And of course, when people go to a different place, they don't lose their culture. So in America, you could see lots of ways that African culture has influenced us. One small example would be music. Jazz and blues and now rap were initially beats from African culture. So that's pretty interesting. And so our next segment will be getting more into the age of imperialism. So thanks for watching.